All right, so today I will talk to you about some work that I did at the University of Washington when I was a postdoc with Eric Shea Brown and Fred Rieke. As David said, I am currently a new assistant professor at Barnard College. So this is a theoretical study of how inputs are potentially recoded in the retina. So the retina processes visual information in very, very sophisticated ways. It does things that maybe a couple of decades ago, it was believed that only the cortex could handle. And a big question is, how can it best encode stuff so that the brain has the best chance of accurately reconstructing or making sense of your visual world? So the retina is basically the interface, like the hardware that your brain uses to stream the high definition visual world around you. But it has a bottleneck at the optic nerve on the way to the lateral geniculate nucleus. And a big source of this bottleneck is the fact that the retina is itself compressive. It starts with a high dimensional array of on the order of about hundreds of millions of photoreceptors, but that is reduced to about 1 million ganglion cells, which are the output neurons that send these signals to the brain. So at every level, you have convergence, and that produces a bottleneck. You have 5 to 10 photoreceptors converging onto a single bipolar cell. And then you have tens, approximately 30 bipolar cells on average to a single ganglion cell. So at every step, the information about the stimulus is being crunched down, reducing, in effect, the resolution of the visual world. In addition to taking in visual information and reformatting it for the brain, the retina adapts its processing mode. The bipolar cells of the retina will actually adapt the linearity of their responses depending on the lighting environment. And what we know is that in low light conditions, there is a linear relationship between the bipolar cells and their responses. Oops, I went too far. Right here. And in those conditions, the ganglion cell encodes information about the mean luminance in its receptive field. But in highly illuminated conditions, the bipolar cells non-linearly process their inputs, and the ganglion cell instead encodes information about the contrast within its receptive field. So this adaptation is behaviorally relevant for us. For example, it's why we are able to read words on a page when we have enough light, but that's difficult to do when the lighting conditions are dim. But there was something puzzling to me about this finding because it indicates that you can get at least as much, if not more, information from your eyes when bipolar cells non-linearly rectify their responses. And this is weird because nonlinear rectification discards information. So to be explicit, for some of the inputs of the stimulus, the neuron will produce distinct responses. But for other stimuli, the neuron might respond the same way for all of them. For example, if the response depends on the brightness of each input, and if each of the pixels in this image were processed by this nonlinearity, you'd end up washing out some of the details. In general, the rectified linear nonlinearity is a fairly representative neuron function because spiking neurons have thresholds, and because neurons tend to be selective for some inputs while not responding to others. And in fact, neural selectivity and different cell types working together in the same circuit seem to be common themes in the brain. But why do it that way when it seems that discarding information is a terrible way to maximize information? So I'll take you through my theoretical study in trying to answer that question. But first, I want to provide a little bit of background about quantifying information. In my research, I use Shannon's information entropy, or simply entropy, which has units of bits. Entropy is often equated with uncertainty. For example, a fair coin toss will have a 50-50 chance of heads or tails, and that's the most entropy that you're going to get out of a two-sided coin, which happens to be 1 bit. And since it could go either way, the uncertainty is at its highest. It's maximum suspense. You will be at the edge of your seat waiting to see if it's heads or tails with this kind of a coin. In contrast to a biased coin, say, that has 90% chance of coming up tails. Then there's not much uncertainty there, since it's a safe bet that it will probably come up tails the next time you flip it. So the information that comes from finding out the outcome of that coin flip isn't worth as much. A biased coin has lower entropy compared to a fair coin, where the probability is as spread out as can possibly be among the different outcomes. If we think about this in terms of a neural code, if a neuron responds to a pineapple stimulus, let's say like this, and also an orange stimulus like this, if it's going to respond the same way to everything, then it's not telling you much at all. And if you look at the set of all fruits that you could present as stimuli to this hypothetical fruit-loving neuron, and the responses that this neuron produces to all of those, then you'd have to say that its responses don't have much entropy. So it's not going to surprise you with its response to cantaloupe. On the other hand, if this neuron produces distinct responses to each fruit, then its responses have high entropy. Basically, you can think of entropy as measuring how spread out a distribution of neuron responses is. Again, imagine the set of all fruits that you could present to that neuron, and then think about the set of all responses to those stimuli. If a neuron only responds at some baseline firing rate, no matter what input it gets, then it's effectively not giving any information about the input, because it has given you no way to tell different inputs apart. But if the neuron separates or spreads out its responses to these different stimuli, the response distribution will have higher entropy, meaning that there aren't as many overlapping encodings and ambiguity is cut down. One of the earliest applications of information theory to the neural code was in the visual circuits of the blowfly. Here it was found that a single LMC neuron in the visual tract has a nonlinear response function that maximizes the entropy of the responses. So nonlinear responses can help to maximize entropy in some cases. And in this case, it does that by tailoring its response function to the distribution of inputs that it gets. With a Gaussian distribution of inputs, the ideal response function for this neuron is the cumulative Gaussian of that input distribution. And what this does is it ensures that the most sensitive part of the response range, where the slope is the steepest, corresponds to the most probable or the most likely stimuli. And the shallowest part of the response function is reserved for the stimuli that don't come up that much anyway, or that often. So the neuron can spread out its responses, making the most of its limited response range. It can maximize the information in its responses by being as unambiguous as possible about the stimuli that it sees the most. But this is a very special case of a very particular neuron, and any deviation from this finely tuned response function would mean that you've deviated from maximum entropy. Also, this study focused on a single neuron, but neural circuits are made of converging and diverging motifs of many nonlinear neurons. The brain encodes signals using many neurons that are layered and that converge and diverge along parallel pathways. So it's unclear what the response properties of all of these neurons should be in order to maximize information. So this is a really, really hard problem, and it's not the one that I tackled. So instead of optimizing over a really, really large set of parameters, I instead ask a simpler question. How much information can a compressive neural circuit with rectified linear nonlinear responses encode? Basically, I want to know if a compressive circuit that has convergence in it is better off with or without rectifying nonlinear responses in their neurons. You've got converging motifs You've got diverging motifs in the retina between on and off pathways and different kinds of pathways. Those are subdivided even more into other parallel pathways. And then you've got nonlinearities. And there are just a lot of places for information to get lost in this circuit. And so my question is really just whether these nonlinearities that are rectifying, so by their nature, they throw away information, are they helping or are they hurting with all of these other elements here? We can model the ganglion cell activity in terms of a summation of bipolar cell inputs, which is classically called a subunit model, where the subunits refer to the bipolar units themselves. Subunit models have been used for a long time to characterize how ganglion cells spatially encode inputs. This gray circle represents the receptive field of a single ganglion cell, which is basically the patch of space in the visual fields that this neuron responds to. And you can think of it as being a conglomerate of the receptive fields of all of the bipolar cells that converge to that ganglion cell. So I used this kind of model as my starting point. Here I'm showing a schematic with two subunits representing the two bipolar cells that sum into one output neuron, which would represent a ganglion cell. And this output neuron would have a receptive field that encompasses 2 pixels in this image. The way I quantified how much information entropy the output neuron responses have was to show many sample 2-pixel image patches to this little motif to simulate the responses and then to compute the entropy of those response distributions. So I'll take you through that now step by step. This would be what the stimulus space of all of the 2-pixel images that I showed it looks like. So for example, a point right here represents a stimulus image with 2 dark pixels or 2 dim pixels. A point from this quadrant would represent a stimulus with 2 bright pixels. This one would have 1 bright and 1 dark pixel. Something from here would have 1 dark and 1 bright pixel. And this brings up an interesting issue because since the linear subunits simply relay their stimulus inputs without transforming them, and the output neuron simply sums up the responses from those 2 subunits, it loses the ability to distinguish between these sample image patches. These would be equivalent. In fact, all of the samples that lie along this line add up to the same thing. Even this stimulus, which qualitatively is very different from the other ones. So there's already some ambiguity happening here, just by virtue of convergence, or adding things up. And what this means is that at the point of convergence, those stimuli represented by the dark purple here will be represented by the same response, making them completely ambiguous. And the output nonlinearity at the end only makes things worse by truncating the response distribution. So it seems like a bad idea to mix convergence with these nonlinearities. And so you might think that making these subunits nonlinear as well could be even worse, but that's not what I found. So what I found was that if the subunits themselves are rectifying nonlinear subunits, they do compress their inputs right off the bat. So instead of that nice full pizza pie shape, it's basically crunched things down into a pizza slice shape at the level of the subunits. And now when you add up the 2 nonlinear subunit responses, you still do get a truncated distribution. But notice how all of the dark purple points span a range of output responses. Those were the stimuli that before were potentially made ambiguous by the convergence or the summation of the subunits. But the nonlinear subunits actually allow the variance in some of the variance in these stimuli to be preserved. So even though these purple stimuli that were ambiguously represented by the linear subunit circuit, the nonlinear subunits have made it so that the convergence of subunits at the output neuron can't treat them in the same way. It's as if the nonlinear subunits have found a way to make that summation or that convergence step less bad in terms of discarding information and reducing the entropy of the output neuron's responses. So that was just a demonstration using 2 subunits. And I want to show you what would happen if the output neuron has more than 2 subunits in its receptive field. Because if you recall, in the retina, there can be tens of bipolar cells feeding into a single ganglion cell. So we'll consider a wider receptive field where more subunits are converged to the output neuron. So in this plot that summarizes that, I have the number of subunits being converged along the x-axis. And as more and more subunits are converged by the output neuron, the nonlinear subunits get better and better at retaining stimulus information. What I'm showing on the y-axis is the response entropy of the output neuron, normalized by the entropy of the sum of linear subunits. That way you can see how the output nonlinearity affects this linear circuit, and then also you can see how incorporating nonlinear subunits compares to that. So what's important about this finding is that neural circuits like the retina may be using this completely counterintuitive compression algorithm to produce a high entropy encoding. And who would have thought that 2 lossy compression steps together preserve more information than one of them alone? But I do want to be clear that the nonlinear subunits are not creating information. They're simply allowing the circuit to not lose as much of it from the convergence. But perhaps we thought this might not be very fair to the linear subunit circuit, because the output nonlinearity is a really big problem for the linear subunit circuit. And we know that there are ways around that. If the output nonlinearity were optimized for the sum subunits, for example, as in having a cumulative Gaussian nonlinearity, then the entropy should be much higher. And indeed, it is. The optimized output nonlinearity gave both circuits a boost, but it really gave the linear subunit circuit a boost. And that's because the summed linear subunits have a broader distribution than the summed nonlinear subunits. So there's more spreading out to be done with this optimal output nonlinearity. But here we're only considering a single output. And I wanted to know if this holds for an ensemble of outputs. After all, we know that there are many different types of cells in the retina, even among just the ganglion cells. And in fact, a diversity of cell types is the rule rather than the exception in most neural circuits. So it would be more fair to compare these compression schemes at the level of an output of an ensemble of output neurons, especially if their nonlinearities make them selective in different ways. With an ensemble, you could have neurons that encode the information that other neurons are discarding. As an example, let's examine a very typical ensemble structure, that of on and off cell types. And many sensory circuits, including the retina, have this sort of structure. So the thought was, maybe by incorporating an off pathway, it can encode the stuff that the on pathway discards. For an on and off output ensemble, we'll have distinct on and off pathways. And for simplicity, we'll go through this example using the same 2-pixel stimulus space as before. And to give a more concrete underpinning to what the on and off pathways are encoding, consider a stimulus distribution that is centered, a Gaussian stimulus distribution that is centered on some baseline or mean luminance of the full image. The darker pixels are to the left of that baseline, and the brighter pixels are to the right of it. Then the on neurons are selective for stuff that is brighter than baseline, as before, and the off pathway is selective for the stuff that's darker than the baseline. In this circuit setup, the on and off pathways have overlapping receptive fields because the on subunits get the same stimulus inputs as the off subunits. The on pathway is basically the same motif as in my earlier example, but it was just being shown alone. The linear subunits, as before, they just relay the stimulus inputs without doing any kind of transformation, except adding a minus sign for the off pathway. And then those signals are summed at the output neuron, and a rectified nonlinearity is applied. And that means that any inputs that sum to less than the baseline centered threshold will be encoded as a zero or a silence by the on neuron. The on output neuron is only selective for the stimuli whose sum is greater than the mean stimulus. And conversely, the off output neuron is selective for the stimuli whose sum is less than the baseline or the mean stimulus. So I'm using the same stimulus space of many 2-pixel images as before, but this time what I've done is I've color-coded the quadrants of this distribution. And I'll point out that the blue quadrant contains all of the stimuli that have 2 brighter than average pixels. So those stimuli will sum to something that is usually greater than the baseline, or greater than 0 if we're letting the baseline just be 0. And the yellow quadrant is the total opposite. Those are the dimmer than average pixels. And those S1 and S2 will sum up to something that's going to be less than 0 or less than baseline. The orange and purple quadrants have mixed stimulus inputs that might sum to something greater than, less than, or equal to 0. All right, so using this, here's how the output responses are distributed for the on and the off output neurons. The on output responses are these stimuli that are plotted on the x-axis, and the off output responses are on the y-axis. So what this is showing you is that all of the stimuli from the blue quadrant end up lying along the x-axis, meaning that those are encoded exclusively by the on output neuron, because the off always rectifies those away. And conversely, the stimuli from the yellow quadrant are encoded exclusively by the off neuron. The stimuli from the orange and purple quadrants, however, they're all mixed in. So indeed, including an off pathway did make it so that a complementary set of stimuli could be encoded. Those stimuli that were being dropped by the on pathway alone were expanded along the y-axis. So now they have a place to go that's not just a 0 on response. But could nonlinear subunits do something even better than what's happening here? I found that the circuit with nonlinear subunits treats the blue and yellow quadrant stimuli the same way that the linear subunit circuit does. So those blue and yellow stimuli end up hugging the axes, but you'll notice that it does something quite different with the orange and purple quadrants. Those points are liberated from the axes now. And what this means is that this circuit is using up more of the response space, and the response distribution is more spread out. So basically, the on and the off outputs can be active at the same time when the stimulus comes from one of these 2 quadrants, the orange or purple quadrants. So there's more possible combinations of on and off responses, which means that the circuit can avoid being as ambiguous as the one that has linear subunits. There are just more ways of encoding the inputs than there were before. And with an ensemble of outputs, the entropy of the linear subunit circuit matches the entropy of the sum of inputs, meaning that the off pathway did manage to recuperate what the on pathway discarded. You can see here, but due to the fact that the normalized entropy is at 1 for the linear subunit circuit, it's basically equivalent to just summing up all of the inputs. But the nonlinear subunit circuit can actually do something even better than that. The nonlinear subunit circuit basically juices more information out of the stimulus than the linear subunit circuit, even though it's using the same number of neurons. And this makes it more efficient. And what this means for a circuit like the retina is that it can produce an efficient representation of something that might be pretty complex or high dimensional. And it does this by leveraging the inherent selectivities and nonlinearities in the response properties of the neurons to form an efficient code. So as before, maybe we should give the linear subunit circuit a little bit more of a chance, a fighting chance to prove itself. So if I again replace the output nonlinearities, instead of just having those be rectifying, if those are cumulative Gaussians that are optimized for the distribution of summed responses, we would expect the linear subunit circuit to gain an advantage again. And it does a little bit, but this time the nonlinear subunit circuit surpasses even that. This divergent circuit structure sets up these complementary parallel pathways that help boost the information encoded by these circuits. So we expected some kind of a boost because it was easy to see how the on and the off pathways each complemented each other. They encode what the other pathway does not encode, or what the other pathway basically drops out. But it was unexpected that the nonlinear subunit circuit would surpass not only the linear subunit circuit, but also the linear subunit circuit with optimized output nonlinearities. The nonlinear subunits themselves seem to be reformatting the inputs and subverting some of the information loss caused by the convergence. So we still wondered, well, how exactly? What's going on in here that's allowing this to happen? What explains this? So one simple explanation for this could be that the subunit nonlinearities are decorrelating their responses. So on the left, I'm showing the distribution of on and off responses for the linear subunit circuit, but right before the output nonlinearity is applied. So basically, you can think of it as the sum of inputs and the negative sum of inputs. So naturally, these are perfectly anti-correlated. But after the output nonlinearity is applied, they are less correlated. But when you compare that to the nonlinear subunit circuit, the on and off outputs are about as decorrelated with or without nonlinear subunits. So it seems that the nonlinear subunits don't decorrelate the responses any more than the nonlinearities at the outputs do. So that doesn't explain why or where this extra boost in information is coming from. And this made us wonder whether perhaps the explanation is that there might be some synergy between the on and off neurons. Synergy is a measurement of information independence. In the model circuit, it would indicate the information independence between the on and off responses. So it's the amount of information that is in the joint response distribution that is not in the on and off responses alone. So basically, if this metric is positive, that means that there's a synergistic relationship between the on and off pathways. It would mean that the joint response contains information that is only available when you're looking at the on and off responses jointly, rather than considering them separately. And if it's negative, then that means that there is redundancy rather than synergy between the on and off responses. So I measured this, and I found that the parallel on and off pathways were not strictly synergistic for any version of the circuit, since the synergy never crossed over 0 into positive values, even as more and more subunits were converged, which is what I'm doing on the x-axis. However, in all of these configurations, there is redundancy between the on and off outputs, but for the nonlinear subunit circuit, as more subunits are being converged, that redundancy is decreasing, making the information between the on and off pathways closer to being information independent and not merely less correlated. So we tried to see if there's any way to sort of fool the linear subunit circuit into being better than the nonlinear subunits. They really were hard to beat. We tried manipulating the weights of the linear subunits to make its output response space resemble the poofiness of the nonlinear subunit circuits. So what we did was we systematically rotated the subunit weights, which are shown in red. And so by default, I hadn't mentioned this before, but the weights are all uniform within this circuit. And there's no learning or optimizing of the weights at all. We were really just messing with the nonlinearities of the subunits. But for this particular thing, what we did was to attempt to manipulate these weights to increase the entropy of the linear subunit circuit. So you can think of the weights of the subunits as in terms of vectors. So the uniform weights for the on and the off subunits by default are overlapping vectors here at 45 degrees. But we can make the on and off subunit weights more different from each other by rotating the weight vectors away from each other until they're 90 degrees apart. And when they're 90 degrees apart, you have a situation here where the off pathway only encodes S1, the first input, and the on pathway only encodes S2. So this makes the on and off pathways as decorrelated as you possibly can make them, since they're receiving completely independent information. And this circuit with orthogonal weights does something interesting to the mixed sign inputs. So it does start to resemble the response distribution from the nonlinear subunit circuit that has uniform weights. You can see that the stuff from the orange quadrant puffs out like it does here, but the stuff from the purple quadrant ends up contracting to the origin. So sadly, it's almost like any gains in entropy that you get from the orange points puffing away and out of away from the axes. It's like that those gains are lost with the purple points basically converging and compressing at the origin. So the takeaway here is that even decorrelating the subunit weights can't get the linear subunit circuit to do as well as the nonlinear subunit circuit can do with just uniform weights. So the nonlinear subunits not only decorrelate the on and off pathways, but they actually recode the inputs so that the final representation contains more information about them. And that's what this shows. So this is all very abstract so far. So I'll finish by telling you what this means in a more concrete way for a circuit like the retina. I found that for the ensemble of on and off output neurons in my model, that nonlinear processing allows them to encode mean and contrast at the same time. So this is the same stimulus spaces as I've been showing this whole time, but I've just color coded it according to a stimulus feature of interest. And here that would be the mean luminance of the 2-pixel stimulus. So the dimmest 2-pixel images are down here along this band, where both pixels are dark. The brightest stimuli are up here where both pixels are bright, and there's everything in between. And for both the linear subunit circuit and the nonlinear subunit circuit, the banded structure of the stimulus of that space is preserved in the responses. And that means that it should be fairly easy to decode the mean luminance of the stimulus from these responses, regardless of whether the subunits are linear or nonlinear. You'll still get that mean brightness information. However, if we look at stimulus contrast, where the high contrast points are in burgundy and they tend to be in the mixed sign quadrants, where a stimulus might have one bright and one dark pixel. And then the low contrast stuff is along this diagonal. So the nonlinear subunit circuit maintains some separation between the different stimulus contrasts. You can see those different bands in its response space, but the linear subunit circuit does not. All of these different stimuli with different contrasts are all lumped together, making it impossible to get any information about the contrast of the stimulus from these responses. So functionally, the higher entropy that we measured in the nonlinear subunit circuit responses is more than just a number. It actually means that the greater amount of information encoded by this circuit has relevance as far as the stimulus features that can be encoded. So I will end by summarizing what I've talked about today. I showed that non-ideal components and structures can, when in combination, produce a compressed representation with minimal information loss. And I talked about how the convergence of rectifying subunits, those nonlinear subunits, preserves the variance of potentially ambiguous inputs. And then later on, I showed how adding a divergent off pathway to the nonlinear subunit circuit does more than simply picking up what the on pathway discarded, because it literally seems to reformat the way that those inputs are represented. And these gains in entropy accompany the encoding of additional stimulus features. And in this case, I showed you how the contrast is encoded in addition to the mean of the stimulus by the nonlinear subunit circuit. But in general, there is more to explore in the flexibility of these computations in the retina. So this was just a starting point.